The whispers reached Naomi Birch before she'd even crossed the churchyard, thin and pleased with themselves, the way gossip always sounded when it thought it was clever. 43 if she's a day, Judith Prout was saying to the circle of bonnets around her, not troubling to lower her voice. Past any hope of a husband now. It's a mercy she keeps herself busy with her needle, since nothing else will have her. Naomi kept walking, her basket of mending balanced against her hip, her spine straight as a fence post. She had learned, over the long stretch of years since her mother's illness had swallowed her youth whole, that the surest way to survive Red Bluff's tongues was to give them nothing to feed on. She did not slow. She did not flush, though the heat climbed her throat all the same. She only nodded to Judith Prout as she passed, as though the woman had remarked upon the weather, and went on toward the dress shop that had been her father's and was now, for better or worse, entirely hers. She had been 18 when her mother first took sick, and 43 now, and in the quarter century between those two ages, she had learned to carry a great many things without letting her face show the weight of them. She had nursed her mother through the long, slow years of her failing, had turned away 2 suitors in that time, because a dying woman could not be left alone with strangers to hire, and had buried both her parents within 18 months of each other. And somewhere in all of it, the county had quietly decided, without ever asking her opinion on the matter, that Naomi Birch had missed her chance at a husband, and ought to be grateful for the needle trade that let her keep a roof. She did not entirely disagree with the arithmetic. She only resented, some days more than others, the smugness with which Judith Prout and her circle recited it, as though a woman's worth wore out like the elbows of a coat. She did not see Walter Crane standing at the edge of the churchyard with his hat in his hands, close enough to have heard every word. She would have been mortified if she had. Walter had come to town for feed and nails and had lingered, as he sometimes did on Sundays, in no hurry to ride the long, empty miles back to his ranch alone. He watched Naomi Birch walk away with her chin high and her basket steady, and something in his chest turned over, slow and unwelcome, the way a man's heart will when he has spent 11 years telling it to keep still. He had noticed her before, the neat, quick hands that turned worn cloth into something a body could wear with pride, the low voice that never joined the gossip even when it swirled thickest around her. He had noticed, and said nothing, because a lonely man of 51 with a played-out house and a dead wife's rocking chair still creaking on the porch had little enough to offer a woman, let alone one the whole county had decided was past wanting. His own wife, Ellen, had been dead 11 years, taken by a fever in a single terrible week that had left him standing in an empty house with a rocking chair he could not bring himself to move, and a silence he had simply learned to live inside. Folks had stopped expecting him to remarry somewhere around the 5th or 6th year, and he had let them stop expecting it, because grief that runs deep enough has a way of convincing a man that love only comes once, and he has already spent his portion. His foreman, a leathery old hand named Otis, who had ridden for Walter since before Ellen died, liked to grumble that a 51-year-old widower with a good herd and a paid-off house had no business rattling around alone, and Walter liked to tell him to mind the fence line and leave a man's heart to its own business. But he had begun, without quite admitting it to himself, timing his Sunday errands to the hour Naomi Birch generally crossed the churchyard, and a man did not do that for a woman who meant nothing to him. He watched her go into the shop and told himself, as he had told himself 100 Sundays before, that it was none of his business. It became his business 3 days later, when he brought in a torn coat and found her standing very still behind her counter with a folded paper in her hand and her face gone the color of old linen. "Mrs. Prout's husband owns the bank," she said before Walter had even asked, because the words seemed to need saying to somebody and he was the only one there. She caught herself at once, folded the paper smaller, and managed a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Forgive me. You didn't come to hear my troubles, Mr. Crane. What's needed on the coat?" "Naomi." He said her given name without quite meaning to, and she looked up, startled, because he had never once used it. "What's happened?" She told him, because there was no one else to tell, and because something in his plain, weathered face made it easier than she expected. The note her father had taken against the shop 2 winters before his death had come due. Called in early by the bank on some technicality she didn't fully understand, and Cornelius Ashworth wanted the full sum in 6 weeks, or the building and everything in it. She did not say, because it was not the kind of thing a proud woman said aloud, that she suspected the timing had less to do with banking than with the fact that Ashworth's daughter Della had set her sights on a certain cattleman, and a certain cattleman had lately taken to riding into town rather more often than feed and nails required. Walter did not know that part. He only knew that the woman in front of him, who mended half the county's clothes and never once complained of the cold walk home in winter, stood to lose the roof over her head because of a debt that had grown teeth in the dark. 6 weeks, he said. 6 weeks. She folded the paper away into her apron pocket as though putting it out of sight might put it out of mind, though he could see it hadn't. "I'll manage it, Mr. Crane. I generally do." He left without another word, which was his way, and she thought no more of it than that he was a kind man embarrassed by another's misfortune. She did not know that he rode straight past his own turning and out toward the Ashworth place, nor that he sat across from Cornelius Ashworth's desk for the better part of an hour asking careful questions about notes and terms and technicalities, nor that he came away from that meeting with his jaw set harder than it had been in a decade. Della Ashworth found him on the porch as he was leaving and laid a gloved hand on his arm in a manner she had practiced. "You've been so scarce this month, Mr. Crane. Papa says you're the most sensible man in 3 counties. I do hope you'll come to the harvest social. I should so like to dance with someone sensible." "I expect I'll be there," Walter said, because it was true, though not for the reason she supposed, and rode home turning over what he'd learned like a stone in his palm. Naomi did not go to Walter Crane for help, because it did not once occur to her that a man of his standing would trouble himself over a dressmaker's debts. Instead, she did what she had always done, which was work. She took in every mending job the county could spare her, sewed by lamplight until her eyes burned, and began, with a care that cost her more pride than she liked to admit, going door to door among her old customers to ask whether they might settle their accounts early. Most were kind about it, in the awkward way of people who did not quite know what to say to a woman confessing hardship. Mrs. Coburn paid what she owed on the spot and pressed an extra $1 into Naomi's hand besides, calling it a Christmas gift come early, though it was only September. Old Mr. Dietrich, whose funeral suit Naomi had let out 3 times as his health failed and his frame did not, sent his grandson round with the full sum and a jar of preserves. But 2 families turned her away at the door with excuses thin as muslin, and at the mercantile Judith Prout made a point of remarking within Naomi's hearing that it was a poor showing for a woman to go begging house to house at her age, as though a body ought to have arranged her affairs better by now. Naomi said nothing, took her ledger home, and added the columns again by lamplight, hoping the sum might have changed since the last time she'd counted it. It had not. It was not enough. 6 weeks was a cruelly short span to raise what 2 winters of debt had grown into, and by the 4th week she had begun, in the small hours when no one could see her, to let herself imagine what it would mean to lose the only roof that had ever truly been hers, to become the county's charity case instead of merely its object of pity, taken in by some cousin or another, her hands idle for the first time in her life. It was in that fourth week that Judith Prout came into the shop with a new bonnet needing a repair, and could not resist adding, over the counter, that she'd heard the Ashworth note was coming due soon, and wasn't it a shame? And wasn't it perhaps for the best, since a woman alone couldn't be expected to keep a business going forever, not at her age, not with no husband to see to the harder parts of it. "I've kept it going 9 years since my father died, Mrs. Prout," Naomi said, quiet and even. "I expect I'll keep it going a good while longer." But that night, alone above the shop with the lamp burned low, she let herself cry for the first time in longer than she could remember, not from self-pity exactly, but from the particular exhaustion of being underestimated by everyone she had ever known, and being too tired, finally, to keep proving them wrong. Walter came to the shop the following Sunday with no coat to mend and no excuse prepared, which was unlike him, and stood just inside the door turning his hat in his hands, until Naomi looked up from her stitching and asked, gently, if something was troubling him. "I've been thinking on your note," he said, "the one at the bank." Color rose in her face. "That isn't a matter I'd have burdened you with, Mr. Crane. I'm sorry if word of it." "You didn't burden me with it," I asked, "and you told me the truth, which is more than most in this town manage." He turned the hat once more. "I went to see Ashworth." Her needle stilled. "You had no call to do that." "No," he agreed. "I didn't. I did it anyway." He told her plainly what he'd learned, that the note's early call had no real grounding in its original terms, that Ashworth had stretched the technicality thin hoping she'd have no one to challenge it, that a lawyer in the county seat could likely have the whole thing thrown out inside a month if she had the means to hire one. "I'd stand the cost," he said. "Gladly. No strings on it. I'd not have a woman lose her father's shop over a rich man's meanness, whatever else does or doesn't come of it." She stared at him a long moment, feeling something crack open in her chest that she'd kept sealed shut for years. Not merely gratitude, though there was plenty of that, but the strange, unfamiliar sensation of being seen by someone who expected nothing in return. "Why would you do such a thing for me, Mr. Crane?" "Walter," he said, "and I expect you already know why, Naomi, even if neither of us has said it plain." She had not let herself know it, not in words, though she'd felt something shifting in her these last weeks whenever his tall, quiet shape darkened her doorway. "I couldn't take your money as charity," she said. "Whatever else I am, I'm not a woman who takes charity." "Then don't take it as charity." He said it steady, the way he said everything without flourish. "Take it as a loan if that sits easier, though I'll tell you plain I've no intention of collecting on it. Or take it," he stopped himself, cleared his throat, looked, for the first time since she'd known him, uncertain. "Take it as a man asking to be allowed to help the woman he's come to think of past all sense, and let the rest sort itself out in its own time." It was not a proposal. It was something quieter and more careful than that, and Naomi understood, standing there with her needle forgotten in her hand, that Walter Crane had just told her, in his plain rancher's way, that he loved her. She did not say yes to anything that day beyond the lawyer, because pride and long habit did not unknot themselves in a single Sunday. But she let him fetch the man from the county seat, and she let him sit with her while the papers were drawn, and somewhere in the weeks that followed, in the small kindnesses, the mended fences he rode over to check without being asked, the quiet suppers he began to share at her table when the shop closed, she let herself begin, cautiously, to hope. One evening in that stretch of careful weeks, Walter arrived at her door with a brace of quail he'd shot, and no notion of what to do with them beyond handing them over. And Naomi, laughing for what felt like the first time in months, set him to plucking feathers on her back step while she built up the stove. They ate at her small kitchen table with the lamp turned low, and somewhere between the quail and the coffee Walter told her about Ellen, haltingly at first, and then with more ease than he'd managed in 11 years. And Naomi told him about the long, slow years of her mother's dying, and neither of them flinched from the other's grief, which was, Naomi thought afterward, its own kind of courting, the kind that mattered more than flowers ever could. "I'd about given up thinking anyone would want to hear the whole of it," Walter admitted, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table. "Ellen's dying, I mean. Folks get uncomfortable if you talk on it past a decent interval." "I know the feeling," Naomi said. "They get uncomfortable if you talk on being unmarried past a decent interval too. Seems there's a great many things this county would rather a person kept quiet about." "Then we'll talk on them anyway," Walter said. "You and I, since neither of us seems inclined to keep quiet forever." And Naomi found, looking at him across the low lamplight, that she believed him. Word got around, as word always did in Red Bluff, and Judith Prout was not slow to sharpen it into something cruel. By the time of the harvest social, the whole county seemed to know that Walter Crane had taken up the dressmaker's cause, and the whole county seemed to have an opinion on what a fool he was making of himself over a woman past marrying age when Della Ashworth, young and lovely and eager, stood ready across the room. Cornelius Ashworth, stung at having his scheme unwound by a lawyer's letter, made certain the story reached every ear before the fiddles started, painting Naomi as a grasping woman who'd wormed her way into a lonely man's sympathy to save her failing shop. Della, for her part, meant to make the evening hers, and spent the better part of a week having a Kansas City seamstress's pattern copied in silk, certain that no dressmaker twice her age could compete with youth dressed so finely. At the general store that same week, Judith Prout had cornered Naomi over a bolt of muslin to inform her, with the particular relish of a woman delivering bad news, dressed as friendly counsel, that a man like Walter Crane owed the county some sense in his choosing, and that everyone agreed it would be a mercy if Naomi spared him the embarrassment of a mismatch before he made a fool of them both at the social. Naomi had folded the muslin with steady hands, and said only that she supposed Mr. Crane was capable of choosing his own company. But the words had followed her home all the same, needling at the small, fragile hope she had only just begun to let herself feel. Naomi almost didn't go. She stood a long while in front of her small mirror in a gown she'd made herself, gray-blue and modest, and she thought, entirely wrong for a woman of her years to be wearing to a dance, and nearly took it off again. It was the memory of Walter's steady voice. Take it as a man asking to be allowed to help the woman he's come to think of past all sense, that finally sent her out the door. The social was held in the Ashworth's great barn, garlanded with lanterns and ribbon, half the county crowded in against the autumn chill, and Naomi felt every eye find her the moment she stepped through the wide doors. Judith Prout's circle turned as one. Della Ashworth, in silk the color of a robin's egg, laughed a little too brightly at something, and glanced over to be sure she'd been seen laughing. Walter found Naomi within the minute, cutting across the barn floor without so much as a nod to Della, and asked her, in front of God and Red Bluff and everyone, if she would do him the honor of the first dance. It was in the middle of that dance, with Naomi's hand resting light and trembling in his, and the fiddles swelling toward the turn, that someone in the loft above knocked loose the big hanging lantern they'd strung for light, and it came down trailing fire into a heap of dry hay stored along the back wall. The barn went from music to screaming in the space of a breath. Flame caught the old dry timber fast, climbing the loft ladder where 3 of the Ashworth hands' children had been sent up earlier to fetch more lanterns, and had lingered, forgotten, to watch the dancing through the loft door. Smoke rolled thick and fast along the rafters. Men shouted for water that wasn't near enough. Women dragged their skirts clear of the doors. And for one terrible moment, The whole barn seemed a single choking confusion with no one at its center. Someone had gone running for the well bucket brigade. Someone else was hauling horses out of the far stalls before the fire could reach them. And above it, all a thin, terrified voice called down from the loft that they couldn't see the ladder, that the smoke had swallowed it whole. Cornelius Ashworth himself stood frozen near the doors, his face gone gray, calling his hands names uselessly into the smoke, as though volume alone might part it. Naomi was the one who saw the children first, small pale faces pressed to the loft rail above the spreading flame, too frightened to find the ladder through the smoke. She did not think of her age, or her reputation, or anything the county had ever said of her. She caught up a horse blanket from the tack wall, soaked it in the water trough by the door, and went straight into the barn while half the grown men were still shouting orders at each other. "This way," she called up, her voice cutting through the panic with the same flat, unbending steadiness she used on unruly hems. "Come to my voice, not the light, the smoke sits high. Come low along the rail." She attended her dying mother through a long, smoke-dark illness once, and learned things about keeping calm in a choking room that no one in that barn had thought to ask a spinster dressmaker whether she knew. She threw the wet blanket over the worst of the flame licking the ladder's foot, and held it steady with her own 2 hands, while the children came down one after another, coughing, into arms that closed around them and pulled them clear. Walter was beside her before the last child's feet touched the ground, hauling her back from the collapsing ladder with an arm like an iron bar. And together they stumbled out into the cold night air, as the barn's back wall gave way behind them in a roar of sparks. The county stood in the yard afterward in stunned, soot-streaked silence, counting heads, thanking God, and staring every one of them at Naomi Birch, who stood with her ruined gray-blue gown scorched black at the hem and 3 sobbing, safe children clinging to her skirts. Judith Prout, for once in her life, said nothing at all. It was Cornelius Ashworth himself, white-faced at the thought of what he'd nearly lost in that loft, who crossed the yard first and took Naomi's blackened hand in both of his and said, low enough for only a few to hear, that he was ashamed of the note, of the technicality of all of it, and that the debt was cleared, full and final, and no more to be said of it. But it was Walter who knelt right there in the trampled, smoking yard, in front of the whole gathered county, and took both of Naomi's soot-stained hands in his. "I've held my tongue longer than a man ought to," he said, loud enough this time for every straining ear to catch, "on account of thinking a woman like you deserved courting proper, with time and patience, instead of a fool declaring himself in a barnyard. But I've near lost you twice tonight, once to a bank's cruelty, and once to a fire, and I find I haven't the patience left in me. Naomi Birch, I don't care what this county has decided about who's too old or too plain or too past hoping for love. I've loved you since before I let myself know it, and I mean to go on loving you the whole rest of my life, if you'll let me. Will you marry me?" The whole yard held its breath. Della Ashworth turned away toward the ruined barn, as though the fire held more interest for her than the question, and no one troubled to watch her go. Naomi looked down at this steady, weathered, unhurried man kneeling in the ash and cinders of a night that had nearly cost them both everything, and felt the last of the old armor she'd worn for so many years. The armor built out of other people's whispers, other people's certainty that she was past wanting, come away from her like a coat she no longer needed. "Yes," she said, and her voice, for the first time in longer than she could recall, did not need to be steady because she let it shake. "Yes, Walter, I will." They were married 3 weeks later in the little Red Bluff church, with the Harvest Social children who owed her their lives sitting in the front pew in their Sunday best, and Cornelius Ashworth himself, in a fit of contrition that lasted rather longer than anyone expected, gave the dress shop's deed outright into Naomi's name as a wedding gift, free and clear. Judith Prout came to the wedding. She sat near the back, and for the length of the ceremony at least, kept her opinions to herself, which Naomi counted as close to an apology as the woman was ever likely to give. Naomi wore a gown of her own making, pale blue, nothing grand, and when Walter took her hand at the altar and looked at her the way he'd looked at her across a smoking barnyard, as though she were the finest thing he'd ever been given the privilege to love, she understood, at last, and for good, that there was no such age as too old for a heart that had simply been waiting for the right one to come and claim it. She kept the dress shop, because it was hers and always would be, and folks said afterward that Naomi Crane's needle was steadier than ever, and her smile brighter besides, as though something long clenched in her had finally been allowed to open. In the years that followed, when a young bride came into the shop fretting over some slight or another that the town's gossips had aimed at her, Naomi had a way of setting down her pins and telling the girl, gently, that a county's opinion was a poor measure of a woman's worth, and that she herself had learned that lesson in a burning barn at 43 years old, which she supposed was proof a body could learn anything at any age, given the right teacher. Walter built her a proper glass front window for the shop that spring, wide enough to catch the morning sun on whatever gown she had pinned in progress, and he took to sitting in the chair by her stove some evenings with his boots stretched toward the fire, content simply to watch her work. It was Walter, riding into town those long years after, who liked best to tell anyone who'd listen that the whole county had once called his wife too old to wed, and that he'd never in his life been so glad to prove a whole county wrong.